The Siberian summer sky was a vast, unrelenting blue, broken only by the shimmering heat waves rising from the dusty expanse of the secret aerodrome. Captain Alexei Savelyev stood on the perimeter, the brim of his cap pulled low against the glare, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was waiting for a legend, or perhaps just a fairy tale told in lend-lease agreements. For months the rumors had circulated. Tales of an American fighter so advanced, so radically different, that it seemed more a product of H.G. Wells' imagination than a factory in Buffalo, New York. Then they heard it. Not the labored, grumbling drone of their own Yakovlevs and Lavochkins, but a smooth, rising crescendo, a high-pitched, harmonic whine that spoke of incredible power perfectly harnessed. They appeared as specks on the horizon, but within moments they were upon them, a formation of four, sweeping low over the field. These were the Bell P-63 Kingcobras. The sun gleamed off their unorthodox tricycle landing gear, a single nose wheel and two under the wings, making them look like elegant predatory birds stalking across the dusty field rather than tail-dragging laborers. Their silhouettes were striking, the long, sleek noses devoid of an engine, pointing forward like an accusing finger. The olive-drab paint seemed to absorb the light, lending them a menacing yet undeniable beauty. As they taxied in, a small crowd of Soviet pilots and mechanics gathered, a mix of curiosity and poorly masked skepticism in their eyes. They knew the P-39 Aircobra, its erratic behavior in a spin, its cramped cockpit. This was its successor, but could it truly be the game-changer the Americans claimed? From the leading aircraft, a figure emerged, not with the heavy, bundled look of a Soviet pilot, but in a light cotton flight suit, leather jacket nonchalantly unzipped, and those ubiquitous dark aviator glasses that seemed to grant the Americans a detached, almost superhuman calm. This was Major Travis "Tex" Miller. He hopped down from the wing with an easy grace, the dust of Siberia seemingly unable to cling to him. He approached Captain Savelyev, his smile broad and genuine, a stark contrast to the guarded expressions of the Soviet officers. Major Miller was the epitome of the American flying officer, confident, charismatic, and possessing an unwavering faith in his machine and his ability to master it. Through the interpreter, a young, nervous-looking lieutenant, Miller's drawl was transformed into precise, albeit slightly dry, Russian. "Captain Savelyev," Miller said, offering a firm handshake, "it's a pleasure. We've brought you something special from across the pond, a little something to help you finish this fight." He motioned to the Kingcobra behind him. "This is the P-63. She's not just a plane, Captain. She's a statement. A statement that we're not just keeping pace, we're setting it." Savelyev looked at the aircraft. It was undeniably sleek, but the engine, a supercharged Allison V1710, was placed behind the pilot's cockpit. This was the source of the skepticism, the fear that the unusual center of gravity would make it a death trap. "Major," Savelyev began, his voice raspy, "your machine, the engine is in the back. Is it not unstable?" Miller's laugh was rich and full. "Unstable? Captain, that rear engine is precisely what gives this bird its edge. It moves the weight to the center, right where you want it for a dogfight. It lets the nose be clear for a weapon that can chew through a panzer. As for the stability, well, that's why I'm here, to show you." He turned back to his Kingcobra, the swagger in his step more pronounced now. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a salesman, a showman, and a true believer in the superiority of American engineering. "Gentlemen," Miller announced, his voice carrying across the field, "if you'll excuse me, I believe I have an appointment with the sky." The ground crew, American mechanics who worked with a speed and precision that left their Soviet counterparts gaping, had already prepared the aircraft. Miller didn't just climb into the cockpit, he slipped into it, as if it were a perfectly tailored suit. The car-style door closed with a reassuring, solid thunk, a sound of quality that seemed alien in this world of canvas and plywood. The startup was instantaneous. The Allison engine roared to life, not with the spluttering protest of a Soviet motor on cold fuel, but with a refined, throat-clearing growl that smoothed into an aggressive hum. Miller didn't wait. He taxied with a speed and confidence that made the Soviet observers wince, turning the P-63 onto the runway with casual ease. He began his takeoff run. And in that moment, the skepticism of the Soviet airmen evaporated like mist in the sun. The Kingcobra accelerated with a ferocity they had never witnessed. It didn't lumber, it leaped. The tricycle gear held it perfectly level, and before it reached the midpoint of the runway, it was airborne. The retraction of the landing gear was so swift it seemed magical. The P-63 was no longer a machine of metal and rubber. It was a silver streak of lethal potential. Miller held it low, accelerating until he was almost a blur, before pulling up into a vertical climb that defied logic. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Sokolov, one of the youngest and most eager of the Soviet pilots. It's like a rocket." Savelyev said nothing. He simply watched, his eyes narrowed, the world around him fading away as the Kingcobra and its pilot began their performance. A demonstration of power, precision, and an audacity that was quintessentially and unmistakably American. The air above the airfield crackled as the Allison engine shifted from a low growl to a predatory scream. Major Tex Miller didn't just fly the Kingcobra. He wore it like a second skin. As the silver-green streak leveled off at 3,000 feet, the Soviet pilots below, men who had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, craned their necks, squinting against the sun. They were used to yaks that fought for every inch of altitude, and Sturmoviks that plowed through the air like armored tractors. What they saw now was a revelation of physics. Miller slammed the throttle forward, engaging the emergency war power. The P-63 didn't just accelerate, it lunged. With a flick of his wrist, Tex pulled the stick back into his stomach. The Kingcobra stood on its tail, its nose pointing straight at the zenith. Most aircraft would have shuddered, their wings losing grip on the thinning air, eventually falling off into a clumsy stall. But the Kingcobra kept climbing. It bit into the sky with a ferocious hunger, fueled by the sheer horsepower of American industrial might. "He's not falling," Captain Savelyev muttered, his hand gripping the holster of his TT pistol. "Look at the rate of climb. It's impossible." High above, pressed into his seat by 4 times the force of gravity, Tex Miller felt the exhilarating throb of the machine. He glanced at the instrument panel. The dials were steady, the needles dancing with precision. He kicked the rudder, and the Kingcobra performed a lightning-fast roll while still in its vertical ascent. It was a victory dance, a display of such casual superiority that it felt like a rebuke to the gravity-bound Earth below. Suddenly, Tex flipped the plane onto its back, diving toward the airfield in a terrifying split S. The speed built instantaneously. 400, 450, 500 miles per hour. The whistling of the wind over the canopy became a roar. To the Russians on the ground, the plane was a blur, a dark shape trailing a ghostly wake of heat. At the very last second, just when it seemed the P-63 would bury its 37mm cannon into the tarmac, Tex pulled up. The transition was seamless. No rattling of the airframe, no groaning of the wings. He roared past the control tower at an altitude of barely 20 feet, the prop wash sending caps flying and knocking over a row of empty fuel drums. "Did you see that?" Lieutenant Sokolov shouted over the fading thunder. "He didn't even lose energy in the turn. It's like the engine is pushing him through the very fabric of the air." But Tex wasn't finished. He brought the Kingcobra into a series of tight, horizontal circles, the dreaded flat turn that usually spelled death for rear-engined planes. The P-39 had been known to tumble end over end in such maneuvers, but the P-63, with its enlarged tail and refined aerodynamics, held the line like a thoroughbred on a rail. It turned within a radius so small it seemed the wingtip was anchored to a single point in space. To the Soviet observers, this was the most shocking part. In the dogfights over the Kuban, the Messerschmitts usually had the edge in the vertical, while the Yaks ruled the horizontal. This American machine seemed to disregard those rules entirely. It was faster in the dive, stronger in the climb, and more agile in the turn. Tex Miller finally brought the King around for a landing. He dropped the tricycle gear, a move that still looked unnatural to men used to tail draggers, and touched down with the delicacy of a dragonfly. He taxied back to the flight line, the nose wheel steering the heavy fighter with an ease that made the ground crew look like they were watching a magic trick. The engine wound down, a long, sighing whistle that left a profound silence in its wake. Tex popped the car-style door and stepped out onto the wing. He pulled off his helmet, his hair slightly damp, but his expression as cool as a mountain stream. He took a pack of Lucky Strikes from his pocket, lit one with a silver Zippo, and blew a plume of smoke into the Siberian air. The Soviet pilots approached slowly, almost reverently. Savelyev was in the lead. He stopped 5 feet from the wing, looking at the man, and then at the machine. He saw the 37mm muzzle poking out of the propeller hub, a weapon that could disintegrate a bomber with a single hit. He saw the high-quality rivets, the flush-mounted glass, the sheer luxury of a cockpit that actually prioritized the pilot's life. "Major," Savelyev said, his voice stripped of its earlier skepticism. He didn't wait for the interpreter. He simply gestured toward the sky and gave a short, sharp nod of respect. "This is not a plane. This is a weapon from the future." Tex Miller grinned, the smoke curling around his aviator glasses. "No, Captain. This is just what happens when you give a damn about your pilots. She's all yours now. Try not to break her heart." As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the tarmac, the Soviet airmen began to realize that the war had just changed. They weren't just getting crates of metal. They were getting the concentrated essence of a nation that refused to accept anything less than the best. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and high-octane gasoline. Following Major Miller's spectacular demonstration, an intense buzz of excitement, tempered by a healthy dose of trepidation, had permeated the regiment. The P-63 Kingcobra was undeniably a technological marvel, a testament to American industrial superiority. But she was also an enigma, an unorthodox machine that challenged everything the Soviet pilots knew about flight. For Captain Alexei Savelyev, the challenge was personal. He was chosen to be the first Soviet pilot to take the King aloft. He had studied the technical manuals, translated by the frantic lieutenant, focusing on the placement of the Allison engine behind the cockpit and the unique tricycle landing gear. He knew the theory, but theory was a poor substitute for the visceral reality of 4 tons of high-performance metal. He approached the aircraft, now officially designated with a large red star painted over the white American roundel on the fuselage. His crew chief, Stepan, stood by, his face a mask of worry. "Be careful, Alexei. This isn't a yak. She feels different." Savelyev nodded, climbing into the cockpit through the novel car-style door. The first thing that struck him was the smell. A pleasant, slightly sweet scent of new leather, high-quality plastic, and delicate lubricants, a stark contrast to the pungent odors of castor oil, plywood glue, and raw gasoline that defined his own aircraft. The cockpit was spacious, the canopy offering panoramic visibility that made the cramped, oil-stained cockpit of his LA-5 feel like a coffin. The instrument panel was a masterpiece of ergonomics. The dials were large, clearly marked, and logically arranged. There was even a clock, a functioning clock, and a gun sight that adjusted automatically for distance. It was a workspace designed for efficiency, comfort, and survival. Aircobra, Aircobra. Savelyev muttered the name of the P-63's predecessor. He had heard the warnings from pilots who had flown the P-39. The rear engine, while beneficial for maneuverability, gave the plane a dangerous tendency to enter a flat spin if mishandled, a maneuver notoriously difficult to recover from. This ghost haunted the cockpit, a phantom pilot lurking in the shadows. He initiated the engine startup sequence. The American-built electric starter engaged with a confident whine, and the 1,325 horsepower Allison engine coughed, roared, and then smoothed into a powerful, even hum. The vibration was minimal, barely a tickle compared to the bone-jarring rattle of Soviet Shvetsov radials. As he began to taxi, the P-63 demonstrated its most immediate advantage: the steerable nose wheel. In a Soviet fighter, taxiing was a clumsy exercise of alternating brakes and rudder kicks, the long nose blocking any forward view. The Kingcobra taxied like a sophisticated motor car. Its pilot afforded a clear view of the runway ahead. Savelyev lined up at the start of the concrete strip. His heart pounded, a mix of thrill and fear. He remembered Tex Miller's soaring vertical ascent, the way the plane seemed to defy gravity. Now, it was his turn to harness that power. He applied full throttle. The P-63 didn't accelerate so much as launch. The acceleration was physical, pressing Savelyev into the plush leather seat. The tarmac blurred beneath him, and long before he reached the midpoint of the runway, the tricycle gear lifted cleanly off the ground. The retracting gear left the aircraft instantly cleaner, sleeker. As he gained altitude, Savelyev felt the true spirit of the Kingcobra. The responsiveness of the controls was telepathic. A mere twitch of the stick sent the aircraft into a roll. A subtle pressure on the rudder pedals caused a precise yaw. It was light, almost too light, lacking the heavy, stable feel of the LA-5. He initiated a shallow dive to build speed and then pulled into a steep climb, attempting to replicate Miller's vertical zoom. The P-63 responded with a power that left him breathless. It was a sensation of pure, unrestricted energy. The speedometer needle swept upward past 400, 450, 500 kilometers per hour. But as he approached the peak of his climb, the shadow of the ghost began to stir. The center of gravity, concentrated toward the rear, gave the aircraft a different feel at the edges of its flight envelope. It was more agile, yes, but also less forgiving. A Soviet pilot, accustomed to manhandling his aircraft, had to develop a new delicacy, a refined touch. He leveled off at 8,000 feet, the Siberian landscape stretching out below him like a vast green sea. The visibility from the bubble canopy was unmatched. He could see his own tail, the horizon, and even a small formation of clouds far in the distance. Savelyev felt a sudden surge of affection for this strange, powerful machine. The Kingcobra was a thoroughbred, but one that demanded respect and understanding. It wasn't just a matter of mastering its unique flight characteristics. It was about trusting the advanced engineering that made it so formidable. He decided to test its true capability in the vertical, the maneuver that had so impressed his peers. He initiated a split S, diving back toward the field, and then pulled up sharply, aiming for a full looping maneuver. The G-forces hit him, a crushing weight that blurred his vision. But the Kingcobra held firm, the powerful Allison engine pushing it through the apex of the loop with an ease that seemed to disregard the laws of physics. He completed the maneuver, leveling off just above the flight line. As the P-63 screened past the cheering ground crew, Savelyev knew that he had not just flown an American fighter. He had been inducted into a new era of aerial warfare, one where power, precision, and technological superiority were the keys to victory. The ghost might still linger, but the Kingcobra was far more than its specter. It was a royal weapon, and it was now in the hands of the motherland. The true test, however, was not solitary flight, but the brutal dance of combat. Major Tex Miller, sensing the silent competition brewing among the Russian aces, suggested a mock engagement. He would take up a second Kingcobra, and Savelyev would try to shake him. It was a bold move, one that could either cement American prestige or bruise it. The two P-63s took off in tandem, a pair of silver predators climbing into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. On the ground, the entire regiment stood still. Even the mechanics, usually busy with wrenches and grease, wiped their hands on their aprons and stared upward. "All right, Captain," Miller's voice crackled through the radio, clear and crisp thanks to the high-fidelity American vacuum tubes. I'm on your 6. Let's see if that Russian soul can handle American steel. Try to lose me. Savelyev didn't need to be told twice. He slammed the throttle into the gate, the Allison engine responding with a surge of power that felt like a kick in the small of his back. He dived, spiraling toward the earth to gain momentum. But when he looked into his rearview mirror, a luxury he was still getting used to, the olive-drab nose of Miller's plane was still there, locked on like a magnet. Savelyev pulled into a high-speed yo-yo, a maneuver designed to trade airspeed for altitude and position. In a yak, the airframe would have groaned under the stress, the wood and fabric complaining at the sudden change in vector. But the Kingcobra was a rigid masterpiece of duralumin. It sliced through the maneuver with terrifying efficiency. Yet, Miller was a master of his craft. He followed Savelyev through every twist, every roll, and every desperate dive. The American was showing them the vertical fight, a philosophy of combat that relied on the P-63's incredible power-to-weight ratio. "You're fighting the air, Captain," Miller laughed over the comms. "Don't fight it! Use the engine! She's got more horses than a cavalry division! Let her run!" Determined to prove his mettle, Savelyev attempted the Cobra's strike, a sudden high-G barrel roll combined with a sharp deceleration. He pulled the stick hard to the corner, his vision narrowing as the G-force drained the blood from his brain. The Kingcobra snapped around its axis with a speed that would have ripped the wings off a lesser aircraft. For a split second, he saw Miller overshoot. The Soviet pilots on the ground let out a collective roar of triumph. But it was short-lived. With a roar of his own, Miller pulled his Kingcobra into a vertical loop, using the sheer thrust of his supercharged engine to climb back above Savelyev. He didn't just recover, he repositioned. Within seconds, he was diving back down, his gun camera clicking away as he shredded Savyev's tail. The engagement lasted 10 minutes, but to Savelyev, it felt like an eternity. He pushed the P-63 to its absolute limits, feeling the way the rear engine allowed the nose to swing with predatory speed. He realized that this plane didn't just follow the pilot's commands, it anticipated them. It was a weapon designed for a pilot who wanted to dominate the sky, not just survive it. When the two planes finally taxied back to the flight line, Savelyev was drenched in sweat. He hopped down from the wing, his legs slightly shaky. Miller was already there, leaning against his fuselage, looking as if he'd just taken a leisurely stroll through a park. "Well flown, Captain," Miller said, his grin wider than ever. "You've got the touch. Give it another week and the Germans won't even see you coming. They'll just see a flash of silver and then nothing." Savelyev looked at the Kingcobra. He saw the way the sunlight caught the refined curves of the wings, the way the 37mm cannon looked like a spear aimed at the heart of the enemy. He realized that the Americans hadn't just sent them planes, they had sent them a standard of excellence. "Major," Savelyev said, extending his hand, "your machine is a monster. A beautiful, lethal monster." "That's American engineering for you, Alex," Miller replied, shaking his hand firmly. "We don't just build things to work, we build them to win." That night in the officers' mess, the talk wasn't about the shortages of bread or the cold of the coming winter. It was about the king. The Soviet pilots, once skeptical, were now eager, their eyes shining with a new kind of hope. They saw in the P-63 a symbol of an alliance that was as powerful as the engine that roared behind their seats. They were no longer just defenders of the motherland, they were the riders of the finest stallions the world had ever seen. The trial by fire came on a Tuesday, 4,000 feet above the bruised landscape of the Polish border. The transition from training to the front had been a blur of American logistics and Soviet urgency. A fleet of C-47 transports had arrived, disgorging crates of spare parts, specialized tools, and enough high-octane fuel to power a small sun. Major Tex Miller and his team of technicians had worked around the clock, ensuring every Kingcobra was a razor-sharp instrument of war. "This is it, gentlemen," Tex had said that morning, standing before the gathered pilots. He wasn't smiling now. "The Luftwaffe is bringing up their best, Focke-Wulf 190 Doras. They're fast, they're heavy, and they're desperate. But they've never met a king. Captain Alexei Savelyev led the squadron, his P-63, named the Siberian Storm, glistening under a thin veil of frost. Beside him flew Tex Miller, acting as an observer and wingman, a gesture of solidarity that had earned him the silent, ironclad respect of every Russian in the regiment. The mission was a sweep of a vital rail junction. Below, the earth was a tapestry of smoke and fire, but up here, the air was crystalline and lethal. "Contact! 3 o'clock high!" Tex's voice exploded over the radio, the American-made transmitters cutting through the static of the front line like a hot knife. A dozen dark shapes dropped from the sun, the Focke-Wulfs. They came in a classic dive, seeking to use their weight and speed to crush the Soviet formation in a single pass. In their old yaks, Savelyev would have ordered a desperate break turn, losing altitude and initiative just to survive the initial onslaught. But today, they were flying American steel. "Sabre Squadron, engage combat power," Savelyev commanded. "Do not break! Climb!" It was a maneuver that defied every German expectation. Instead of diving away, the 8 Kingcobras tilted their noses up. The Allison engines, boosted by their superior superchargers, roared with a ferocity that seemed to push the planes upward on a pillar of invisible fire. Savelyev watched the lead Focke-Wulf in his reflector sight. The German pilot, realizing his altitude advantage was evaporating, tried to pull out of his dive, but the P-63 was already there. The American machine's rate of climb was so superior that Savelyev found himself staring at the belly of the enemy fighter within seconds. He squeezed the trigger. The 4 50 caliber machine guns in the wings sparked, tracing lines of white fire through the air. But it was the 37mm cannon in the nose that delivered the iron verdict. A single massive shell left the muzzle, struck the Focke-Wulf's wing root, and the German fighter simply ceased to exist. It didn't catch fire. It disintegrated in a spectacular bloom of debris and fuel. "First blood to the king!" Tex's voice cheered over the loop. The dogfight devolved into a swirling vortex of silver and black. The Germans were stunned. Their tactics, honed against lesser machines, were failing. They tried to outdive the Americans, but the P-63 caught them. They tried to outclimb them, and the Kingcobras soared over them like hawks over sparrows. Savelyev felt a strange, cold clarity. The aircraft responded to his every whim. When a Focke-Wulf attempted to get on his tail, he pulled a high G turn that would have snapped the spar of a lesser plane. The Kingcobra's airframe didn't even vibrate. It sat in the turn with a rock-solid stability that allowed him to keep his sights perfectly aligned. He saw Tex Miller's plane to his left. The American was a poet of aerial destruction. He moved through the sky with an ease that made the brutal business of war look like a choreographed dance. Tex drew 2 Germans into a vertical chase, then executed a perfect hammerhead turn at the top of the arc. As the Focke-Wulf stalled in the thin air, Tex dived back down, his machine gun stitching a pattern of lead across both cockpits before they could even recover. "They can't handle the vertical, Alex!" Tex shouted. "Keep them climbing! Show them what Uncle Sam sent you!" For the next 20 minutes, the sky belonged to the P-63. The Soviet pilots, empowered by the technical superiority of their mounts and the tactical brilliance of their American mentor, dismantled the Luftwaffe formation. It wasn't a battle, it was a demonstration. By the time the remaining Germans broke formation and fled toward the west, 6 of their number remained as oily smears on the Polish soil. The Kingcobras? Every single one was still in the air, their Allison engines humming a triumphant tune. As they turned back toward the aerodrome, the sun catching the silver-green wings of the formation, Savelyev looked over at Tex. The American major flashed a thumbs up. Savelyev realized then that this was more than just a victory for a squadron. It was a testament to a nation that built its tools with a belief in the impossible. The Kingcobra wasn't just a plane. It was the embodiment of a dream where technology and heroism met to forge a path to freedom. The return to base was unlike any other. Usually, the end of a mission was marked by a heavy, somber silence, the sound of men tallying the cost of survival. But as the 8 Kingcobras circled the airfield in a perfect, tight-knit formation, the ground crews erupted. They had watched the distant smoke trails and heard the muffled thunder of the 37mm cannons. They knew the king had claimed its throne. One by one, the aircraft touched down. The tricycle landing gear, once a source of suspicion, now looked like the legs of a champion athlete. Sturdy, modern, and defiant. When Savelyev cut his engine, the silence that followed was filled with a new kind of energy.
He hopped down from the cockpit, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. Before he could even unbuckle his flight helmet, he was hoisted onto the shoulders of his mechanics. "6 of them, Captain! 6!" shouted Stepan, his face smeared with grease and tears of joy. "Not a scratch on our birds! Not a single bullet hole!" Tex Miller climbed down from his own P-63, moving with that same easy American swagger, though his eyes showed a deep, quiet pride. He walked through the crowd of cheering Soviet soldiers, who parted for him as if he were one of their own generals. He stopped in front of Savelyev, and for a moment the two men, one from the vast plains of Texas, the other from the rugged heart of Russia, simply looked at each other. There were no translators needed for this moment. Tex reached into his jacket, pulled out a second silver Zippo, brand new, still in its box, and pressed it into Savelyev's hand. "A gift, Alex," Tex said, his voice low and steady, "for the man who proved that the machine is only as good as the soul behind the stick." Savelyev looked at the lighter, then at the row of Kingcobras lined up on the tarmac. Their long, lethal noses pointed toward the west, toward the final push that would end the nightmare of the war. He realized that the Americans hadn't just provided an edge in technology, they had provided a bridge. That evening, the mess hall was transformed. Bottles of vodka sat side by side with American bourbon. The smell of cabbage soup mingled with the scent of Spam and Lucky Strike tobacco. Language barriers dissolved under the weight of shared adrenaline and mutual respect. Through the smoke and the laughter, the American instructors and the Soviet pilots toasted to the king, the plane that had turned the tide. Tex sat at the head of the table, showing a group of young pilots how to fold a proper paper airplane, while Savelyev sat across from him, explaining the nuances of the Eastern Front winds. They were two different worlds, two different ideologies. But in that room, they were simply brothers in arms, united by the roar of the Allison engine and the dream of a sky without enemies. As the night deepened, Savelyev stepped outside into the cool air. He looked at the silhouette of his P-63 against the starlit sky. It looked less like a machine of war and more like a promise. A promise that when the best of humanity works together, nothing, not even the gravity of a dark age, can hold them back. The Kingcobra had done more than win a dogfight. It had forged a bond of iron and silver that would be remembered long after the guns fell silent. The glory of the daylight dogfights was soon eclipsed by a new, more sinister threat. As the front lines shifted, the Luftwaffe began utilizing the cover of total darkness to harass the Soviet supply lines. They used modified Junkers 88 bombers, painted soot black, slipping through the radar gaps to rain fire on the advancing railheads. The Soviet Yaks were blind in the dark. Their short range and lack of sophisticated instrumentation made night interception a suicidal gamble. But in the hangars of the elite Guard Regiment, the Americans were already ahead of the curve. "She wasn't just built for the sun, Alex," Major Tex Miller said, tapping the glass of the P-63's artificial horizon. "Back in the States, we've been training for this. The King has the stability for instrument flight that your wooden planes can only dream of. Tonight, we hunt by feel." The mission was a scramble. Reports had come in of a heavy bomber formation crossing the Vistula River, heading for the central ammunition depot. The sky was a void, stripped of stars by a thick layer of low-hanging stratus clouds. Savelyev climbed into the cockpit of the Siberian storm. The American engineers had installed a series of small, ultraviolet blacklights that made the radium-painted dials of the instrument panel glow with an eerie emerald light. It was a masterpiece of foresight. While the enemy was flying into a black abyss, the American technology provided Savelyev with a digital map of his own survival. "Sabre 1, you are cleared for immediate departure," the controller's voice crackled. The takeoff was a test of pure nerves. Without a horizon to guide him, Savelyev leaned entirely on the American gyroscopes. He watched the needles, steady, precise, and unwavering. The Allison engine roared, its exhaust flames licking the sides of the fuselage like blue tongues of fire. The Kingcobra lifted off into the ink-black sky, transitioning from the earth to the void with the grace of a ghost. "I'm with you, Alex," Tex's voice came through the headset. He was flying 200 yards to the right, invisible in the dark but present through the rock-solid radio link. "Keep your eyes on the gauges. Trust the machine. She won't lie to you." They climbed through the freezing mist of the clouds. In a Soviet fighter, the moisture would have begun to ice the wings, causing a fatal stall. But the P-63 was equipped with American de-icing boots, rubber membranes on the leading edges that pulsed with air, cracking the ice before it could take hold. It was another layer of technological armor that the Germans simply didn't account for. "I have them," Tex whispered. 5 miles out, bogies at 12,000. They're heavy and slow. Savelyev looked ahead. At first, there was nothing. Then he saw it. The faint, rhythmic pulse of blue-white flame from the Junker's exhaust stacks. They were silhouettes of death moving through the night. "Don't use your tracers," Savelyev commanded his flight. "We use the cannon. 1 shot, 1 kill. Let the darkness be our shield." The Kingcobras closed the distance with terrifying speed. The German tailgunners were looking for the glow of Soviet engines. But the P-63's rear-mounted Allison was shielded by the fuselage. Its heat signature dissipated. They were invisible predators. Savelyev lined up behind the lead bomber. He didn't look at the plane. He looked at his glowing American gun sight. He adjusted for the slight drop of the 37mm shell, a calculation made easy by the stability of the airframe. He squeezed the trigger. A single, massive thud vibrated through the floorboards. The shell streaked across the dark gap and struck the Junker's fuel tank. The explosion was blinding, a colossal sphere of orange fire that turned the night into day for a fraction of a second. The bomber didn't just fall. It folded in half, its back broken by the American steel. "Sabre-led, target destroyed," Savelyev reported, his voice calm, mirroring the detached professionalism of his American mentor. Panic erupted in the German formation. They began firing blindly into the dark, their tracers lighting up the sky like a frantic 4th of July display. But the Kingcobras were already gone, dipping into the clouds and reappearing from the shadows. It was a slaughter in the silence. The technological gulf was too wide to bridge. The Germans were fighting a war from the last decade. The Americans had provided the tools for the next century. By the time the sun began to bleed over the eastern horizon, the Vistula was clear. The night sentinels returned to base as the first light caught their silver wings. They hadn't just defended a depot. They had mastered the one element the enemy thought was theirs. As Savelyev taxied to his spot, he saw Tex Miller waiting by the fuel truck, a thermos of hot coffee in his hand. Tex didn't say a word. He just raised the cup in a silent toast. The message was clear. The King owned the day, and now it owned the night. As the spring of 1945 thawed the blood-soaked soil of Europe, the German High Command retreated into the Alpine Redoubt, a final, desperate cluster of mountain fortresses designed to hold out for years. One such stronghold, codenamed Drachenzahn, the Dragon's Tooth, sat atop a jagged peak in the Tatras, protected by a ring of high-altitude anti-aircraft batteries and hidden hangars carved directly into the living rock. The Soviet command knew that a ground assault would be a massacre. The only way in was from above. "This isn't a job for a scalpel, Alex," Major Tex Miller said, unrolling a detailed topographical map produced by American Aerial Reconnaissance. "This is a job for a sledgehammer, and the P-63 is the heaviest hammer we've got."
The plan was a daring, high-altitude strike. The Kingcobras would carry 500-pound American bombs, munitions built with high-grade explosives that packed twice the punch of the standard Soviet equivalents. They would dive from 20,000 feet, using their incredible speed to bypass the flak, and deliver their payload directly into the hangar mouths. "Remember," Tex briefed the pilots, his voice sharp with the intensity of a true leader. "The air is thin up there. Your engines will be screaming for oxygen. But the Allison has a 2-stage supercharger that doesn't care about altitude. While the Germans' engines are gasping, yours will be roaring. Use that power. It's the finest engineering in the world." Savelyev sat in the cockpit of the Siberian Storm, feeling the extra weight of the heavy bomb slung beneath the belly. In a lesser plane, this weight would have made takeoff a terrifying gamble. But as he opened the throttle, the Kingcobra surged forward. The American horsepower was undeniable. It pulled the overloaded fighter into the sky with a raw, muscular confidence that sent a thrill of pride through every pilot in the squadron. They climbed into the thin, freezing air of the upper atmosphere. At 25,000 feet, the world below was a blur of white and gray. Savelyev checked his instruments. His oxygen system, in advanced American design, supplied a steady, reliable flow, keeping his mind sharp while the enemy below suffered from hypoxia. "Sabre Squadron, I see the tooth," Tex's voice came through, clear as a bell. "Formation, Diamond, follow me into the abyss." The fortress appeared, a gray concrete scar on the white mountain. As they approached, the sky erupted in a forest of black flak bursts. The Germans were throwing everything they had. "Break now!" Savelyev commanded. He rolled the Kingcobra onto its back and pulled into a vertical dive. This was the moment of truth. The speed built with terrifying rapidity. 500, 550, 600 miles per hour. The whistling of the wind against the canopy became a scream. In any other plane, the controls would have locked up under the immense pressure. But the P-63's hydraulic-boosted ailerons remained responsive. Savelyev steered the 4-ton projectile with the precision of a surgeon. The hangar mouth loomed in his sights, a dark rectangle in the side of the cliff. "Steady, steady," he whispered to himself, trusting the American ballistics tables he had memorized. He pressed the release. The Kingcobra leaped upward, suddenly light, as the 500-pound bomb sped toward its target. Savelyev pulled back on the stick, the G-force slamming him into his seat. He looked back just in time to see his bomb disappear into the hangar. A second later, the mountain itself seemed to exhale. A colossal plume of fire and debris erupted from the hangar, followed by a series of secondary explosions that shook the very foundations of the peak. The American explosives had found the fuel and ammunition stores. "Direct hit, Alex! The tooth is pulled!" Tex roared over the radio. One by one, the other Kingcobras delivered their iron gifts. The fortress, once thought impregnable, was being dismantled by a handful of American-made fighters, flown by men who had learned the true meaning of air power. As they leveled off and headed back toward the plains, Savelyev looked at his wings. They were scarred by flak, but the airframe was as steady as a rock. He realized that this victory wasn't just about courage. It was about a nation that refused to settle for good enough. It was about a machine that allowed a pilot to reach for the impossible and grab it with both hands. "Tex," Savelyev said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think the Germans have finally learned the English word for overmatched." Tex Miller's chuckle was the sound of a man who knew his work was done. "It's a good word, Alex. Let's go home." The transition from the European theater to the Far East felt like stepping from one circle of hell into another. But for the men of the Elite Guard Regiment, the scenery was secondary to the machines they commanded. By August of 1945, the Trans-Baikal front was a beehive of mechanical activity. Under the scorching sun of the Mongolian border, the air was thick with the smell of parched earth and the sweet, heavy scent of high-octane American fuel. Captain Alexei Savelyev stood on the wing of his P-63, the Siberian Storm, shielding his eyes from the blinding glare. The landscape was a desolate, monochromatic expanse of yellow dust and rolling hills, stretching toward the jagged silhouette of the greater Khingan Mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay the Kwantung Army, a million-man force entrenched in concrete and fanatical resolve. "It's a different kind of beast out here, Alex," Major Tex Miller said, climbing up onto the wing beside him. The American wore a sweat-stained flight suit, his aviator glasses reflecting the vast, empty sky. He had followed the squadron halfway around the world, unwilling to let his kings go into their final battle without him. "In Germany, we fought for every city. Here, we're fighting the distance. If your engine quits over those mountains, you're not a prisoner of war. You're a ghost in the desert." Savelyev nodded, his hand tracing the smooth, cool rivets of the fuselage. The Kingcobra looked even more advanced, more alien, in this primitive landscape. While the Soviet ground troops moved in ancient trucks and horse-drawn wagons, the P-63 represented the pinnacle of 20th century industrial might. Its tricycle gear sat level on the uneven ground, its long nose housing the 37mm cannon that was destined to be the final word in this conflict. The order came at dawn. The Soviet spearhead had begun its lightning thrust into Manchuria, and the squadron was tasked with clearing the high-altitude passes of Japanese fortified nests. The takeoff was a symphony of power. Savelyev opened the throttle, and the Allison engine responded with a surge of energy that felt almost sentient. Despite the thin, hot air, which would have left a yak gasping for breath, the American supercharger compressed the atmosphere with clinical efficiency. The Kingcobra accelerated down the dirt strip, the nose wheel lifting early, and within seconds, Savelyev was climbing at an angle that seemed to defy the heavy load of 500-pound bombs slung beneath his wings. As they reached 20,000 feet, the temperature inside the cockpit dropped. Savelyev adjusted the heater, another small American luxury that kept his hands nimble while the world outside turned to ice. He looked to his left and saw Miller's plane, a silver-green dart hovering in the crystalline air. The visibility through the bubble canopy was so perfect, it felt as if he were suspended in the void by nothing but sheer will. "Sabre Squadron, eyes front!" Savelyev's voice crackled through the radio. The American communication gear was so clear he could hear the faint rhythm of Miller's breathing. "The Khingan passes are ahead. Look for the concrete slits in the granite." The Japanese Hoto fortifications were masterpieces of defensive engineering. Carved directly into the mountain peaks, they commanded the narrow valleys with heavy artillery and machine guns. As the squadron approached, the mountainsides erupted in a flurry of anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese were using 25mm Type 96 cannons, rapid-fire weapons that filled the sky with jagged shards of hot steel. "Don't break formation," Savelyev commanded. "Trust the armor. We're going in low." He rolled the Kingcobra into a steep dive. The speed built instantaneously. This was the true test of the American airframe. The pressure on the wings was immense, but the P-63 was as rigid as a diamond. He could feel the vibration of the flak bursts around him, the metallic ping of small arms fire bouncing off the armored belly of the plane. In any other fighter, this would have been a death sentence. But the Kingcobra was built to survive. Savelyev centered his gun sight on a massive concrete bunker guarding the mouth of a tunnel. He waited until he could see the individual stones of the mountain. Thump, thump, thump. He squeezed the trigger, and the 37mm cannon roared. The heavy shells, moving at over 2,000 feet per second, struck the bunker with the force of a falling star. The concrete didn't just crack, it pulverized. A second later, he released the 500-pound bomb. The Kingcobra leaped upward as the weight fell away. Savelyev pulled into a high G turn, the hydraulic boosters in his controls making the maneuver feel effortless. He looked back and saw a pillar of fire erupting from the mountain. The bunker was gone, collapsed under the weight of American high explosives and Soviet determination. "Direct hit, Sabre-Lead!" Miller's voice cheered. "Keep the pressure on! They've got nowhere to hide from the king!" For 4 hours, the squadron dismantled the Japanese defenses. They flew with a precision that was terrifying to behold. The P-63 functioned as a surgical instrument of destruction, moving from target to target with a speed that made the Japanese anti-aircraft crews look like they were moving in slow motion. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the impregnable mountain line had been shattered. As Savelyev turned back toward the base, he looked at his fuel gauge. Despite the intense combat and the heavy climbs, he still had a comfortable margin. The American engineers had understood that a fighter's most important weapon wasn't its guns, but its reach. He looked over at Miller. The American pilot was performing a slow victory roll over the plains. In that moment, the war felt truly won. Not just because of the territory taken, but because of the union of these two forces, the raw courage of the Russian soul and the clinical, unstoppable brilliance of American steel. The Kingcobra had found its final throne in the east. The sun hung low over the Manchurian horizon, a swollen orb of crimson that seemed to set the very dust of the steppes on fire. The silence that had descended upon the airfield was heavy, not with the tension of impending battle, but with the profound, hollow weight of a world suddenly at peace. The Kwantung army had surrendered. The last pocket of resistance in the Khingan caves had been silenced by the relentless thunder of the 37mm cannons. Captain Alexei Savelyev stood by the tail of the Siberian storm, his hand resting on the smooth metal of the stabilizer. The Kingcobra was a mess of oil streaks, gunpowder residue, and small arm scars, but to him, she had never looked more beautiful. She was a survivor of 2 continents, a mechanical bridge that had carried him from the brink of despair to the pinnacle of victory.
"She's a hell of a girl, Alex," a voice drawled from the shadows of the wing.
Major Tex Miller stepped into the fading light. He was no longer in his flight suit. He wore his Class A uniform, the silver wings on his chest catching the last rays of the sun. His bags were already loaded into the C-47 transport idling at the far end of the runway. The American mission was over. The engineers, the instructors, and the dreamers from Buffalo were going home. "I was looking at the flight logs," Savelyev said, his voice thick with the dust of the campaign. 10,000 miles, 6 months of combat, not a single engine failure, not one lost pilot due to mechanical stress. Your nation, you build things to last forever, Tex. Miller leaned against the fuselage, looking out toward the mountains they had conquered just days before. "We don't just build them to last, Alex. We build them to give our boys a fighting chance. In the States, we have a saying, the best is barely good enough. I think the Kingcobra proved that. She gave you the edge when the world was falling apart." Savelyev reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver Zippo Tex had given him months ago. He flicked it open, the flame steady even in the evening breeze. "I used to think that war was won by the side with the most men. But flying this machine, I realized it's won by the side that respects the pilot enough to give him the finest steel, the clearest glass, and the most powerful heart." "That heart is going to be a museum piece soon," Tex said with a wistful smile, gesturing toward the Allison engine behind the cockpit. "The age of the propeller is dying. The jets are coming, Alex. Faster, louder, colder. But they'll never have the soul of this bird. They'll never know what it was like to feel the torque of 1,300 horses kicking you into the sky." The C-47 let out a series of short, sharp blasts from its horn. It was time. Tex extended his hand. "I'm leaving you the spare parts, the manuals, and the specialized tools. But most importantly, I'm leaving you the kings. Treat them well. They've earned their rest." Savelyev took the hand, his grip firm. "In Russia, we have a saying too. A friend is someone who shares your bread and your fire. You shared your fire with us, Tex. The fire of your industry, the fire of your courage." The 2 men walked toward the transport plane in silence. The ground crew, Russian mechanics who had learned to love the American machines as much as their own, stood in a double line, snapping to a crisp, unprompted salute as the American major passed. It was a gesture of respect that transcended politics and borders. At the cargo door, Tex turned back one last time. "Hey, Alex, if you ever find yourself in San Antonio, look me up. I'll show you what a real steak tastes like." "And you come to Moscow," Savelyev shouted over the roar of the transport's engines. "I will show you that our winter is not so cold when you have a brother to share the vodka." The transport roared down the strip, lifting off into the purple twilight. Savelyev watched until the red navigation lights were nothing more than a memory against the stars. He walked back to his P-63, climbing into the cockpit one last time. He didn't start the engine. He simply sat there in the quiet, his hands resting on the control stick. He looked at the dials, the glowing American gauges that had never lied to him. He thought of the vertical climbs, the midnight intercepts, and the mountain fortresses that had crumbled under his wings. The Kingcobra was more than a weapon. It was a testament to what happens when a nation pours its genius into the protection of a single human life. As the moon rose over the Manchurian plains, casting a silver light over the rows of P-63s, Savelyev knew that while the planes might eventually fade into the halls of history, the legend of the king and the men who tamed it would live forever in the hallowed silence of the sky. The war was over, the king had reigned, and for the first time in 4 long years, the world was quiet.